Good morning and welcome to the 10th SDS webinar. My name is Christopher. I work with our clients and new business at SDS, along with my colleague Ricky Prota. And Ricky actually has a new scheme. He won't appear on the webinar, but he has a new scheme where if you book a demo with him, he'll give you a Starbucks coffee voucher. Did you know about that, Andrew?
No.
Yes. Yeah.
You've been scheming things together. I know that. Yeah.
Joining
out of
us
his
today,
own money. Out of his own money. Yeah.
No, I
okay.
think didn't you clear that? Didn't you sort of
Yeah.
say he could use the company credit card for that? Okay, we'll talk about this later.
Yeah. Sure.
Our senior, I'm sorry, what's your title again, Andrew? You head up our consultancy and new business. Oh, we're getting some
Sorry, we've got a bit of feedback.
There's some feedback. Oh, sorry. Who's that?
1 second. I'm not sure.
Can everyone mute their...
Yeah, I'm sorry, having some technical difficulties. That just literally happened. Andrew, are you muted?
How do I?
Okay, if you just bear with us. Okay, we're back. We're back. Sorry about that.
We've lost Sean.
We've lost Sean. Sean will be joining us again. I'm going to introduce Phil Shelton. So Phil is the CEO of SDS. Phil, thank you so much for joining us today.
No worries.
I actually, Phil, you actually are the inventor of SQL. And I think that's why we've kept project management a little later, so we could obviously have you on and we know a bit more what we're doing until obviously that technical hitch just now. But yeah, thank you very much for joining us. For people who don't know, Phil's dad, David Shelton, was quite into his viability, and he created obviously Landval and ProVal, which are used thoroughly in the industry today. And what Phil did was he actually built on that incredibly well with SQL, which is our project management a lot of you use. So yeah, Phil, thank you very much for joining us. Hopefully Sean will be back just in the nick of time. Here we go.
Well,
I sincerely apologise to the panelists and to everybody watching. We've returned to the office and therefore we're enjoying the dummy fire alarm test. But I'll speak to the landlord about it later. So sincere apologies to everybody.
I'm glad we got to the bottom of it. So we got a Labradoodle in the background there. Okay. Today is all about avoiding development disasters. When things go wrong in development, and lots of things can and will go wrong, you essentially end up in very deep water, and obviously everyone wants to avoid that. So we're going to look at what we would sort of classify as the top 5 pitfalls, and then look at some stories about when those things have gone wrong and what happened. So if you're listening to this, please do let us know if you have any stories. We'd absolutely love to hear those as well. In the meantime, let's kick off. So to begin with, unrealistic expectations. That's Phil, would you like to kick this one off?
Yeah, so this was just to sort of get things started. We're talking about project management, and often the issues faced by project managers is unrealistic expectations by other stakeholders or sponsors in the project. And so if you projects, invariably things change, things move, things slip, and it's often as a result of the goalposts being moved by other people. So, you know, it's if the design or quality of the project changes after it's started, then obviously that will add time, it will add cost, and yet seemingly the people asking for this believe it should also be delivered for the same budget and the same timescale that they originally agreed to, and then beat people over the head for these delays. And as a project manager, you know, there's what's called the sort of holy trinity, the triangle of time, cost, and quality. And if you're going to change any one of these 3 elements, then the others have to give way. So if you increase quality, then you can't expect time and cost not to change with it. Time will increase, cost will increase. So even if you want to reduce costs, then quality also has to go down as well, although you may improve delivery time. And those three things are the kind of backbone of sort of delivering a project and managing expectations in that sense. Of those three, managing the costs, development officers sometimes believe that's the job of the finance team. It's not. The project manager or development officer is the person who should know exactly what's going on in terms of cost in their project and be managing it. The quality should be determined by the brief and requirements of the stakeholders, and that should be written into any contracts and be part of any tendering. And obviously then you have time, and that's much harder to predict, clearly, because the further out you're predicting something, the harder it is to get it right. So it's something that you should be reviewing constantly and looking forward to see, are we getting anything happening? Are we having any kind of small issues happening which could snowball into bigger delays further down the line? So it's having to be very focused on detail today and being able to see bigger picture stuff in the future. So it's a challenging role.
And have any ideas there from you, Sean, on historical sort of evidence where that's gone really wrong in terms of the expectations of the stakeholders?
Yeah, I mean, I think given the audience, Chris, the one stakeholder that we're all dictated to by is Homes England on many of our grant programs, and without being disingenuous to the officers of Homes England, they're dictated to by unknown peoples from our point of view who are just fixated on numbers and delivery. And therefore we have this artificial date at the end of March every year. So in a historic context, Chris, history repeats itself every year in housing development, whereby Homes England are desperate to get numbers in by the end of each financial year. We, as people involved in the sector, are keen to meet those aspirations. Therefore, we make promises and we make commitments that maybe are stretching it right from the outset. And we don't leave ourselves enough scope whereby it allows for things to go wrong. We, as a practice representing many clients, learn the hard way that when we're moving dates in IMS, which is the computer system that Homes England operate via, you are, historically now, we're much clearer. Just move it once and move it a long way into the future. Don't keep moving it every couple of months, because you're wearing away people's confidence in you to manage the project. But if you were to ask me which external stakeholder has the most amount of bearing on delivery, I would advocate it's Homes England, because we're keen to meet the ideas, but very often construction projects don't work on a 12-month cycle. It just doesn't operate that way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Something strikes me. When we're doing appraisals, there's something we've been talking about a lot. 30 years, 60 years. Some people are doing them for 100 years. They're increasing the time element on it. Is doing something for 100 years, is that realistic? Is that a way of just sort of fudging the figures so that it all kind of stacks up? And forgive me if that's...
Because it is.
It certainly helps. It certainly helps.
Well, there's different ways you can make an appraisal work, isn't it? And it comes back to risk. And so there are, depending on what your criteria is for an appraisal being approved, you're either looking at something like NPV or you're looking at something like payback or profit. And so in NPV terms, if you extend the period, then it makes it look better, although the returns diminish the further out you go. So looking at over 100 years is kind of a bit daft, but effectively you're just saying it's never going to end. It's an NPV in perpetuity. But the other way of looking at it is to say, actually, we won't do it over that long period. We'll actually just reduce the discount rates that we're using, because that will have the similar effect. But yeah, it's just a model. It's a way of saying, should we invest money in this project or not, and how long are we going to be around to sort of see it being there? And if you take the view we're not going anywhere for a long period of time, and we're going to have those assets for a long period of time, then it's not an issue. Unless, of course, as we were talking about earlier, government decide to bring in flexible right to buy. That could change that view.
And to give the other end of the spectrum, Chris, you know, many of us operated on a 25-year model and a 30-year model. And then again, without being disingenuous, many board members, especially I recall, struggled to understand the concept of what we were actually saying. What we're actually saying is that there's going to be a certain amount of income for a fixed period of time and a certain amount of outgoings for a fixed period of time. And what does that flow equate to? They lost all concept that they still own the asset at the end of 30 years. So I think the moving out of the period has been a positive step by associations who largely work on the basis of holding assets for a very long-term period. Phil's right to flag up flexible right to buy, just as what view do people take on staircasing in shared ownership? We don't actually know what people are going to do. We can look at historic trends and kind of make educated assumptions based on that, but we don't know. So yeah.
Well, that's
I
a
think
fair point.
I think the move to longer periods is a positive step, personally.
I think local authorities coming into the market has obviously pushed that parameter out a lot more. I think certainly I see appraisals where local authorities are taking a view of over 45 years, something between 45 and 60 years. And especially if they want to do lower rents on social rents, then there's only a few parameters that have to kind of give and shift to try and make it work. I think one of the risks that most development people kind of fall into is they get emotionally involved into their scheme, and it doesn't matter what it is, it's going to work. We're going to make it work somehow, some way, because we're going to do this. I think that is a very risky thing to kind of get involved in.
Yeah.
Okay. Moving on to communications. Point number 2.
Yeah. So communication, okay, we talked previously about unrealistic expectations. Communication clearly therefore would be managing expectations. I heard this nice story, which I just made a note of. Somebody who'd moved into a big London bank, and he said he started working as a consultant for this bank, and when he arrived, it became clear there was this very serious communication issue. The staff and the consultants working on the same project had formed into different cliques and basically refused to talk to each other. I mean, literally refused to even communicate with each other. And clearly, this is not good from a project management point of view. And I read that and I thought, oh, that's good. You know, I mean, that would never happen in a housing association or a council. And then stopped and thought, yeah, because the finance team would never, you know, withhold information from the development team, or the development team would never not do their forecasts for the finance team and let them know what's going on. Oh, no, wait, that's exactly what does happen quite often. So communication, effective communication between teams in that respect, in terms of being open and talking to each other, when that's in place, the organisation does well, and when it's not, everyone struggles. And I think you've got some thoughts on this as well, Sean, on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think as my observations have been that as many of the registered providers, some of whom will be watching today, have expanded their development appetite, they've naturally structured their teams in a very different way. So you'll often have a growth team and you'll have a delivery team, and that's perfectly logical. But if we kind of take a step back from that and you imagine you're a growth person, I imagine your work review looks a little bit like how many opportunities have you brought in, how many have we delivered, so on and so forth. It's layering on an additional pressure for that person then to go to the legal team, the finance team, the sales team and say, I'm looking at this site, is it the right site in the right location? Is everybody comfortable with it? So on and so forth. If your one key work objective is to bring in sites, there's a natural temptation to just bring in sites. And you're constantly going to people who are kind of putting a little bit of a dampener on things, or a risk assessment on things, then you're going to be reluctant to keep going back to hear what you essentially don't want to hear. So the role of the overseeing project manager, I think, is to try and make sure that everybody stays on the same page, which is what is the outcome for the business at the end of the day.
And you mentioned a 6 hats theory. Would you like to talk about what that is, Sean?
Yeah, so the 6 hat theory that we use with clients from time to time is a well-known concept, and if people want to Google it, there's lots of variations on a theme. But generally speaking, people choose careers and choose workplaces that match their personal characteristics. So whether you're risk averse or opportunistic or a details person or a non-details person, and whenever there is communication, so let's go back to the old-fashioned meeting in a room. Can you imagine that happening again? People will default to their natural characteristics. So if you're the person who's looking for difficulties, you'll highlight those. If you're the positive one, you'll highlight those. The idea of the 6 hats is that you wear a different character for the purpose of that meeting. So if you're the really positive person, task that person with trying to highlight what the negatives and what the possible pitfalls are. If you're conversely the negative person, give that person the green hat, which is all opportunistic and new and fresh ideas. And I like it because when I use it, it makes sure that everybody gets an equal amount on the microphone, because very often people don't like speaking up, they don't have their say, and then in the worst extreme, they'll then try and deconstruct the arrangement behind the scenes afterwards. So 6 hats theories is a nice way of doing it. If anybody wants a tip, we bought 6 matching coloured hard hats. Yeah, okay, I can see people rolling their eyes. It's a bit gimmicky. I get it. But when you've got people in a room, it is a nice way of making people think and look through different people's eyes.
Yeah.
Guys, just thank you so much, Sean. That's absolutely awesome. I'm getting background from someone. I'm not sure I can hear someone talking in the background. Just if we could, I don't know whether we can do anything about it or not, but just so you know. Thanks a lot. I'm really interested in what we see a lot is the differences in how finance and development communicate and work together. And we see all kinds of different examples of that. And what I really like is Hackney were able to double the amount of schemes the development department supported through using ProVal, and the finance department would use ProVal, and they would get in and they would all be able to access the same appraisals and they would all be on the same page. So the communication element works really well when you all have access to the same sort of appraisal system. You can save a lot of time when you're going back and forth and testing sensitivities. So number 3, poor planning. Phil, kick us off on poor planning.
Yeah, I think this is where there's sorts of various acronyms along the number of P's that you can have to about poor planning and preventing poor performance and all the rest of it. But yeah, obviously, poorly planned projects, they don't get better just by throwing more money at it or more resources at it. We're not doing different projects every time. We're not doing something that's brand new every single time. There are new sites and there are new practice designs that happen to come along the way, but by and large, the process is fairly well understood and can be followed. And with any luck, you have up-to-date development procedures and a strategy that kind of allows people to actually think and plan things through properly. But sometimes, that doesn't happen, and we've been in cases before where we've been to an organisation and they, potentially they might be new at development or they might not, but they've said, here we are, here's the scheme we're working on, and it's great, it's our flagship scheme, or it's this wonderful new thing, we're demonstrating this, that, and the other. And we said to them, well, okay, sure, let's have a look at the appraisal, let's have a look at what's happened in there. And they're like, oh no, we haven't got an appraisal, this is just something we want to do. And they literally just been plowing money in it. And it's true story, there's no cost or budgets to this. It was just like, we want to do this project, and they just plowed money into it without thinking. And funnily enough, they lost a lot of money, this particular organisation, on this scheme, which they would have avoided if they planned it all out up front and done proper budgets. And then that's the role of the project manager sometimes, is to say, you know, this is a flawed project, this shouldn't go ahead, or this, you know, there should be alarm bells being rung, not just being pushed through from top levels down because somebody fancies a vanity project.
Being the voice of dissent is a very difficult thing in these scenarios, isn't it? How would you handle that, Sean? I'm sure you've seen a number of these projects. I know Andrew has.
Yeah, it's slightly easier for us in many circumstances because we're invited in to oversee the project. We don't have to live and breathe the outcomes of that particular project. So in many ways, I take my role really seriously as being prepared to be the voice of dissent. We've got a meeting this afternoon that will be a little difficult in parts, but that's why you ask an external advisor to come in and give you some guidance and some thoughts. And so I absolutely recognise the model that Phil described, and rather it does go back to the more streamlined we try to be about our businesses, with people with key specific tasks and key measurable outcomes. You are creating this model where people are paid to find new sites and paid to hand over units as quickly as possible and paid to do X, Y, and Z. And therefore there are going to be tensions where somebody will want to promote something forward, and dare I say it, because it helps meet their key work objectives, as opposed to, is this the right thing for the overall business to do? So it's slightly easier, Chris, from our point of view, because we stand outside of that, and therefore if we end up making an awkward relationship with legal or finance or any colleagues for that matter, you know, we don't have to see them in the kitchen the following day and work with them and go on the Christmas do while they tell us some home truths. You know, it's slightly different from that point of view.
I mean, I remember my dad working when he was chairman of a housing group in Slough many years ago, and he, funnily enough, he was involved in the development committee as well. But an appraisal was brought, or a scheme was brought forward to the board for approval, and it was a really good scheme. It had really good mix of units. It had brilliant kind of payback and sort of financial reserves. It met the needs for the sort of size of properties and types of property they were getting, and it was all good, and they were sort of running through it, and then suddenly there comes a question like, where someone sort of picks up on something, goes, where is this site actually? And based in there in Slough, this site was in Newcastle upon Tyne, and it was like, no. So it gets thrown out straight away. Nowhere near in our strategy are we talking about having properties in or doing these things. But it was a case of people getting carried away with, like, this looks like such a great idea, instead of stopping to think and plan, does this match the strategy? Does this match what we're trying to achieve as an organisation? You know, you think what a hell of a lot of wasted time and effort that was. We should actually have been knocked out immediately when they knew where the site was, but hadn't been planned.
Phil, I remember that story, and I think I think the argument was that they could jump on a plane and get to the site in under an hour,
yeah, that's right.
and it's the same hour of traffic getting to any of their local sites. It was just, it was
regardless of the maintenance or management of those later on.
yeah. And I'll tap into that. I mean, I've been to local authorities and they want to kind of, starting in development, and they want to do passive house. This was a couple of years ago scheme, and all the intentions were very good, but they've never done it before. They've never done development before, and they want to kind of go on down this line. And you really need to tap into your strengths and weaknesses and understand them, and deliver schemes, and then build on that basis.
We had and I'm not going to name names, but a really big local authority up north recently. They just showed no interest in actual viability. They just had their targets. They wanted to build it. And that was a conversation I think we couldn't believe, but it does still happen.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Been involved in quite a lot of those.
Yes.
All right. Number 4, risk management. This is a bigger one. Phil, would you like to kick off this one?
Yeah. Everyone is project management is about also managing risks clearly and what can go wrong. I always found like I'd seen before doing any of this stuff, you know, you see risk maps and you'd see like, here's list out all the risks and tell us if it's going to be high, medium or low impact. And if the more sophisticated ones added severity as well. So you'd multiply likelihood by severity to get an outcome. And I just found them a bit kind of like, well, okay, yeah, stuff's going to go wrong. I think most people have a sort of intrinsic understanding of what things are, you know, the severity of something going wrong. But in sort of learning more about it and sort of spending more time on it, one of the things that came out of it, which I think is important, is in part of your risk map that you're setting out and listing, you know, when you're actually setting out your risks, is actually what happens if that does happen. I mean, there's mitigation, you know, if costs go around, well, okay, we go back to approval or what do we do? But actually setting out a communication plan for who needs to be informed when and how quickly, you know, and at what stage, makes those risk maps become something which is quite useful, because when it starts to happen, you don't have to stop and think about it. You don't have to have meetings about it. You've got, this is exactly what I need to do step by step. And what goes hand in hand in that then is having a plan that's detailed and specific, not vague and overarching, like, what's the risk? Well, things could slip, you know, that's not a risk, that's just a statement of fact maybe, but it's not enough to be able to do any kind of sensible risk management with. And, you know, reporting on those and keeping an eye on those sort of indicators is really important. And those risks can be kind of, there's all sorts of things. I mean, it's probably, I know we were talking about this a bit earlier on, Sean, do you want to pick up on some of the things around different types of risks, well, just within the project alone, the build phase in that sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, from my point of view, I think risks ebb and flow. When we used to be doing affordable rent as the dominant tenure, then you know, I never got grilled about demand figures. You know, we used to regularly speak about the fact there was 4,000 people on the waiting list. So to some extent, you could almost build a property as long as it was in a geographic location for those waiting lists. There was never a question about demand. Then when we entered the world of housing for sale, of course, you heighten a risk. So there's ebbs and flows. I would say at the moment, the couple of obvious ones for me at the moment, we've had, certainly in the northwest of England, we've had a couple of high profile contractor failures, and they've both failed, or the most recent two have failed for the same reasons. I think the sector, the housing sector, has kind of abused the essence of JCT, design and build contracts. I think we have enjoyed the fact that we perceive that we're transferring all of the risk to a contractor, and therefore we can make these sort of statements at board that says, don't worry if we come across something unexpected in the ground, it's the contractor's risk, it's this, that and the other. Actually, we didn't always give a great deal of design availability, because we had a set of employers' requirements that were so specific as to name products and fixings and so on and so forth. So I think in an attempt to manage risk, as Phil's just outlined, we ended up using a tool that wasn't really designed for that purpose. And I do question whether we'll continue to do that in the future. And secondly, in light of contractor failure, and the first time on the call, I think, to bring up COVID, in light of the outcome of COVID, one of the other risk management tools that we default to is that we'll do a Dun & Bradstreet check on the contractor. We'll look back at a couple of years of accounts, and then we'll say either, yeah, they're good or not good for a couple of £1 million contract. And so in a real life scenario, I do wonder now whether is that going to be sufficient? And I'd put a big question mark as to whether it is. And if it isn't going to be sufficient, picking up Phil's second point, so what is going to be sufficient then? What are we going to ask of contractors that they can possibly give us the confidence we need in order to award them a huge contract with great confidence that they're going to see that through to completion? So I would see that as a stage, a moment in time now where we need to look again at maybe how are we addressing some of these risks.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially what we're saying is the accounts that we would use to audit these contractors are now invalid after the event of COVID.
Well,
they're
I think,
we can't trust them as much.
yeah, I think there's a question. There's definitely a question for me, Chris, about the impact of COVID, and I'll come back to explain a little bit further in a second. But there's a more primary question of looking back at 2 years ago accounts. Was that ever really an accurate measure, or was it simply the only measure really that we could go to with reliable continuity that satisfied finance and governance colleagues, and therefore that's what became the norm, as it were? Going back to COVID, I'm not trying to design a future world that's all about COVID. I think we're very much in the eye of the storm at the moment. I think the world will look different in 6 months' time, in 12 months' time. What I do think, however, is that COVID is potentially a change moment for real structural change within businesses, and I include contractors in that. I think everybody on this call, everybody listening and watching, will have spent the last 12 weeks reviewing what they do, both professionally and personally, and asking, are we doing the right things? Do I want to carry on doing the right things? So on and so forth. And I don't see constructors being any different. And I don't know whether they want to get back into the world of a race to the bottom in terms of price wins on every matter, and whether actually we're going to start to have a different relationship.
I think as well, with the contractors from a management point of view as well, I think from when we deal with customers and we're looking at contractor management, I think quite a few are shocked when you actually run some reports that show their exposure to certain contractors and just how much they have wrapped up. And obviously part of that risk is actually well, as you say, the tool we have to assess if a company is any good or not is they have a set of accounts and they have business and they, they have a good credit score effectively, don't they? And you don't really have any other measures, concrete objective measures to say if they're going to be around or not in the future. But you can manage the risk by making sure not all your eggs in one basket to the extent that I think they often are. And that's perhaps down to the fact there are not, vast numbers of contractors out there able to do the work to the standard and size that you require. But even so, you can still kind of keep that under review.
But if I could just jump back in, Chris, just for 1 second. If we just, as a very binary measurement then, our traditional method of managing risk is to hold on to our money for as long as we possibly can in the hope that we haven't given it them before they fail. But maybe in the new world, imagine if we did fortnightly valuations as opposed to monthly valuations. Imagine if we paid all invoices on 14 days, not 21 days. So actually, we let go of our money sooner to aid the other party and avoid some of these issues. I just wonder whether it's time to be having those sort of conversations as opposed to seeing risk from how do we protect ourselves, because by protecting ourselves in certain instances, we're actually amplifying the issue that may cause the difficulty in the first place.
That's what Duncan was saying.
Yeah, it's right. I could collect a shudder from the finance people watching about managing all those payments going out every 2 weeks instead of every month.
Duncan Smith was really quite, he was quite passionate about supporting your contractors. And you're absolutely right, especially if you look at what Carillion did, where it's very easy just to sort of make them take on all the risk and take on a lot of the cash flowing. And if they go down, it doesn't matter as long as we're okay and we're still here and our careers are still intact, and some new contractors will appear, because they always do. Just that is a really horrible, it's not a sustainable approach. So building sustainable long-term relationships, it means taking care of your contractors instead of palming risk off on them. That's essentially what we're saying here.
Sean, are you seeing more organizations bringing in the construction side into the organization as a whole and having construction directors and construction and holding that in closer?
Yeah, Andrew. Again, there's kind of peaks and troughs. People have tried it. None of what I say on these calls is meant to be disrespectful. Genuinely not. It's just an open, honest observation of what I see in the marketplace.
Sure.
Over the last 5 years, I've seen an increasing number of boards who have voted for the creation of development companies. My experience is that that's fundamentally flawed, because they want to do that because A, they believe all contractors are making absolute fortunes on every project, and B, because very often they'll have a workforce that is set up to do what I perceive to be construction related tasks, and therefore if you fit in a heating system as a replacement heating system, why can't you fit it in a new build scenario? And therefore we can do our own work, as it were. That fundamentally doesn't work in that way. If you're going to set up a new build contract operation, it really needs to singularly focus on that, in my opinion. There are a couple of examples, certainly on Merseyside, where a couple of the larger RPs have really gone for this in terms of in-house development, and they will openly tell you that the profit margins are closer to what the contractors were saying than they ever imagined, and fundamentally they've inherited the risks that we've grown up to pass on over the last few years. So I'm not saying they're not going to carry on, I'm not saying it's not going to be a success, Andrew. All I'm saying is it isn't just a simple plug and play system. Let's not pay anybody external to do this piece of work for us. Let's bring it in-house. There are clearly, for the finance people, Phil, there are clearly other financial benefits from doing it within a group structure, and that's not to be underestimated. For my money, if you're going to go down that route, and again, I'm not arguing against it, what I do like the appeal of is having control of the capability and the capacity of the contractor at all time, because otherwise, as I've just alluded to, we really don't know what the financial position or indeed the order book of contractors looks like when we award them contracts.
They're not going to volunteer it either, are they? Every few weeks. So just make sure you let us know your cash flow is okay.
Well, I think there's a difference. Sorry, go on, Sean.
No, I suspect maybe not, Chris, but maybe if you're not going to tender to 12 contractors on every job and you're going to look for a trusted arrangement with 2 or 3 people, maybe you can agree different. Maybe you can agree different. What I'm advocating is let's have these honest conversations. What for contractors, clearly we won't name them, but my conversations with contractor staff once the contractors had failed was so much more transparent than it was a couple of weeks earlier when that contractor was hanging on by the fingernails, because they were told, don't say this in the marketplace, don't say this to the client. We were told, don't do this, don't do that. It's kind of, there's a whole artifice going on, and it might just be better if we were closer together in certain areas.
And I think a lot of that's to do with obviously how you can carry on trading as well, isn't it? And what you know, at what point people are communicated to, which makes it very difficult at that point when you're managing that.
Yeah.
I mean, the only other good thing as well, if you have your own, I mean, the idea, I think from a private developer world point of view, if you manage your own build, and the benefit to doing that is you control the speed at which you develop your site. And so if your demand drops off, you mothball until your demand picks back up again, and so on. So you don't just build, buy, and then stuck with work, you know, that asset on the book with not being sold. But yeah, in terms of managing the risk of that, as you say, massively bigger risk to bring that in-house and sort of have all the kind of things that could go wrong, and no kind of no ability to step away from it.
Yeah, Chris, one last point from me, if I may. Just that use of the phrase managing risks. I mean, my other worry about the marketplace trying to operate at the pace or an increased pace is that we end up cutting corners. So I see a number of tender packages that are going out with very scant information. By default, we are increasing the risk by not exposing. To my mind, undertaking a thorough site investigation is not a risk management. That's just a part of the job. Most people know that, notwithstanding contractor failure and 1 or 2 other things that we've talked about on this call, most people will accept that below the ground lies the biggest risks. So it's really incumbent on us as part of the job to have a good idea what lies below the ground before we go out to tender, and certainly before we let the contract. Managing it after the effect is not good risk management. I think risk avoidance is probably a better tactic.
So it comes to, when we're talking about site abnormals, you're talking about the expected ones, okay? So the expected ones that a site visit will show is things like Japanese knotweed, newts, badgers, bats, these sort of ecological things, but then the completely unexpected stuff. And the unexpected stuff you say is underground mine works, unexploded ordnance bombs, archaeology, graveyards, and that's why we do outturn appraisals. But you had an issue with the graveyard, didn't you, Sean?
Yeah, so just to highlight that very point, we agreed to buy a piece of land. It was a former graveyard, so alarm bells should be ringing anyway. If you're buying a piece of land on Water Street or Sand Street or any of those names, I suggest the clues in the title. And we were given documentation that evidenced the removal and the exhumation of all the graves and the removal and reburial elsewhere. So we were prepared to buy the site. We had the documentation. We felt like we'd completed each task. What we didn't allow for, and I'm hung by my own petard here, was that we were totally unaware that back in the day, if you couldn't afford a burial, it became custom and practice to just bury people as close to the church foundations as possible. So you couldn't afford to buy an actual burial plot, but you still felt it necessary to be buried in a pauper's grave type situation as close to the church as possible. So we were on site, started excavation, came across human remains. The job, of course, immediately halts, and then you're into having to go through the process, which at the time, I think it's been shortened now, but at the time was Secretary of State approval. So you know you're in for a long, not only delay, but reputationally and financially was the way that we had to deal with it. You had to exhume all of the bodies, host a reburial, arrange things with the church. Now, listen, lots of people on this call, this is why we do the job, because things come up that are different, that make the job interesting. Otherwise, we'd have chosen a different career. But to my mind, Chris, that is a completely unexpected risk that you need to deal with. Some of the things we're alluding to in your list, Japanese knotweed, so on and so forth, to my mind, that's not an unexpected risk. A thorough site investigation will highlight those things.
Okay. Yeah. So don't buy graveyard land. Is that be very careful?
Close by.
Just do your homework. Yeah.
We've got the fifth. We're coming up to the fifth point, and that is people. So stakeholders and training. Yes. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah. Well, no, we sort of started to touch on these things now already in terms of stakeholders and the importance of them, and how they can have they can disproportionately impact your scheme. There was the story I had sort of made a note of was really was nothing to do with housing, but it was just as an example of a similar thing could happen with Homes England, I guess, but it was to do with a system called eBorders, which was the advanced passenger information system designed to collect information on passengers as they come in and out of UK airports. And they did a pilot program and they signed with Raytheon Systems to develop a full system. And there are problems emerging from, they awarded in 2007, problems started emerging in 2008, milestones being missed, problems being reported, carried on until the election of a new government in 2010, who promptly then just terminated the contract outright, and no doubt went on to do something just as expensive and bad next time round. But that particular project was cancelled, and from Raytheon's point of view, they lost the bid. But in this instance, there was an example of, you know, a project started, people are working on it, you think it's going ahead, and then somebody else comes in outside, a stakeholder with whom you have no control in that sense, comes in to kind of move the goalposts. And, you know, it's a similar example would have been the government changing the inflation rules back in 2016. You know, setting the year before, turning around and saying, we'll give you the wonderful certainty, you can carry on for 10 years at CPI +1. Woohoo, off you go, everyone sets it up. And the next year, oh, actually, no, we changed our mind. Now we're going to deflate for the next 4 years at -1. And yeah, tough. And you had no control over that. And it will have had a big impact on the organisations, as you all know full well. So don't underestimate, you may not, you know, they're not, obviously they're the big ones like Homes England, there are also others, and there are people, stakeholders in your organisations who can politically cause problems for you and delay and cause issues with your projects as well, if you're not keeping them on board and not talking to them. So again, really comes back to, for me, that comes back to communication again.
Sean, you have this, your mantra is about making the stakeholders appreciate levels of flexibility.
Yeah, I mean, I think the case in that Phil highlighted there, yeah, there are those seismic shifts, the deflation of rent being the most obvious example in recent times. There are other shifts, aren't there? I've heard in my conversations now people criticising works that are underway around the development of new office blocks, for instance, because now we're in COVID, people are going, who's ever going to want an office block? But we all know that to get to that stage, there will have been 2 or 3 years worth of preparation. So construction has a time lag built into it of any magnitude. So somebody on this call now may very well acquire a site for housing for sale for very good reasons today. And without planning, that might be 2 years before that gets to site. By the time it gets to site, we've no idea what the marketplace might look like. So my comment around flexibility is that we need to recognize, we being the global entity needs to recognize that doing property development is a risky entity. We are making judgments based on the evidence that we can see and forecast into the future. It doesn't stand to logic that we can't have some degree of flexibility. Where I get slightly frustrated about flexibility is that very often when we're running appraisals, people will give us a set of employers' requirements and specifications and assumptions, and we'll run those numbers, and maybe the figures don't match because we have to have that particular boiler, that particular window frame, so on and so forth. It doesn't work, and therefore they don't proceed with the project, only to replace it by buying some Section 106 off a house builder that doesn't have any of those elements, but the business can operate with a different boiler if it's bought a Section 106 property, but it can't have a different boiler if it's building its own property. I think as a sector, we've got to get better about, are we really getting hung up on the wrong things in terms of detailed elements to the individual projects without appreciating the effect that that has on the viability.
Yeah, absolutely. The maintenance teams and their requirements for what they will and won't accept us for maintenance, and then you build properties, I think is another interesting area of discussion in that, just on itself.
Mm-hmm.
So how we manage sorry, Karen.
No, sorry, carry on.
Oh, no, please, you. I thought we'd finished.
Yeah, no, I was going to say the other topic we sort of picked up then was training, and so I was just as a kind of last final quick bit was how many people I know who are project managers in job title and are not project managers by training, and don't have any kind of accreditations or qualifications in that, and that's more apparent when people are new into the sector, or perhaps you get people who sometimes move across from, say, housing management into development because it's a kind of they see that's a nice looking job and they want to get involved in that and do that side of it. And it doesn't take much to get some accreditation in that sense. There's various bodies like APMP is a kind of general project management body. There's also Prince 2, which was set up by the government. And so what it does do is kind of give people, you know, they're not long courses in that sense, are they? But they give you the kind of, how do you do this stuff properly, and what stages and how should these things be presented and worked through. And I think that's, knowing that, because you don't know what you don't know, you know, is really important. And so when making sure that people are getting well trained and know, you know, and able, so they're able to deal with these situations that we talked about going wrong, I think is really important.
Sean, do you think Prince 2 is relevant to development? Do you think that's just a sort of, do you agree with Phil on that? That everyone, this is something you should just have to take the training, look at what the people are saying, and then apply it to your sector?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I can see the values of Prince 2. For me, what it installs is a sense of behaviours and an overview of how to run a project from the beginning to the end. Again, just going back to something I said 20 minutes ago, we're seeing more and more compartmentalisation of development teams. People are being slotted in to do particular parts of the development function. And I absolutely get that, because if you're going to develop at volume, then maybe that's the model. Maybe that's the only model if you're going to try and reach those kind of numbers. The bit that worries me is a little bit like what's happened out there in the construction marketplace in terms of contractors. Certainly when I first started, if you went onto a site, the architect back in the day ran the whole show. If you had any questions about any detail, it was the architect that you went to. They knew every single facet of it. As we've gone into more of a contractor management type model with our contractors, you can go on site, and generally speaking, there isn't somebody with overall insight and in-depth knowledge about the whole project. There are different people dealing with different aspects. And okay, I'm bringing it up, so I'm making the link. But when we all read with horror the outcome from Grenfell and the fact that there were 260, 270 different businesses involved, and actually Dame Hackett pointed out that nobody actually had an overarching view of the whole thing, it kind of highlights that compartmentalization to accelerate delivery is a good and understandable thing, but only if you are very, very confident that somebody is sat above it all with the whole thing under control from start to finish. So I think Phil's right to highlight that Prince 2 and such models should exist. I'm not advocating that everybody in the team should have it, but I think somebody should have that knowledge, that qualification, or at least that understanding of continuing to look at the whole project as opposed to individual pieces.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that comes on following on from that, I think we see as well, is when you a common split is to have a new business team and a delivery team, as you say. So you have people going out and finding your sites and people then doing the delivery of the site. But you know, in a project, in a kind of project delivery kind of context, the person who sets up the project, the person who's gone out and found the site and has done all the initial work, has set the whole thing up, has negotiated everything and put it there, and then hands it over to a project manager to actually do the kind of the delivery, the construction phases. Quite often you see that initial new business person walks away. It's like, well, there you go, I'm off now, I'm going to do my next site. When in reality, that person should still be there overseeing what the project manager is delivering all the way through to the end of the project, because the project hasn't stopped just because somebody else is doing a phase of it. And as you say, having somebody with that oversight and visibility of the whole thing is really important, but often doesn't always happen in a very coherent way, I don't think.
But even Phil, if you don't have your growth person sat with your operational team all the way through construction, because you are comfortable that actually we're just going to go through a construction phase now and nothing's happening. When you do a post-scheme review, it almost dictates to me that your growth person should be the first person on the invite.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really what I'm saying to that person, this is what the customer thought of the site or the design or whatever you agreed that this business was going to undertake. There's kind of less need for the operational delivery people in a post-scheme review as opposed to the growth people. But
Yeah.
as we know, I'll just mention it again, the construction time lag is so long that by the time a resident has moved into a property, you want to allow them a few months to settle in and find the faults and highlight the things that they like and don't like. By the time you undertake that post-scheme review, the growth person has acquired another 3 or 4 opportunities that are going to be the opportunities for the next 2 or 3 years. So at what point are we intervening to learn from previous projects? How are we doing that?
Good point.
We are, guys, this has been a really great conversation. I've really enjoyed it. We are running out of time though. We literally have 2 or 3 minutes left. Sean, I just want to thank you so much for, appearing with us again, and especially at short notice. That was really great of you. I had been talking about an MMC special, but we sort of lost they wouldn't, the people. All right, well, Homes England wouldn't come on again. That's I'm gonna pussyfoot around it. Yeah. So basically, unfortunately, we were hoping to do that, but we weren't able to in the end. So this came together very quickly. I want to thank you so much for that. And Phil, it was really, I'm glad we've been able to have you on the show, and thank you as well.
Cheers,
Andrew, is there anything else you'd like to say in closing remarks?
Closing remarks, what are we doing next week, Chris? We've got viability. Are we doing residual? No, we're doing service costs, aren't we? We're reviewing
That's right. So
the impact of service costs on an appraisal and
dark art service charges.
Service charges, sorry.
The dark art service charges.
Yeah, and how important they are. So we've got Pascal, who's busy writing a book for the NHF about this subject matter. She's coming on, and I'll be interrogating her with Chris about the impact we can look at that on viability.
Yeah, I did. Who knew you could write an entire book on service charges? It's a big area. I'm looking forward to that.
Lovely.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for watching, and we will be seeing you next week. Thanks again, everyone.
Thanks, Sean.
Cheers.
Thanks.
Bye now.
Bye, guys.
Cheers. Bye now.